Alright, so these are two classics that I just kind of felt like go together in a way where you can look at it from, like, some of the details, like it's, you're looking at a marriage and there's horror in and around it, and you've kind of got this whole thing going on where the marriage is like, there's a lot of closeness, but there's also a lot of distance, and then there's a child involved living or dead or unborn, and everything just kind of seems to be looming around everything, and it gets more and more induced with dread as it goes on. That's about as close as they get as far as like what happens in them, but I wasn't really that interested in that when I put them together. It was more so just kind of the general vibe I get from both of them feels somewhat similar to me, and I figured they were just comparable enough in a way that we can go ahead and run with this. But mainly, it's just it's not even about pitting them together or anything, but just more so of like a celebration of both of them, because how else do you talk about these two movies? So that's pretty much how I feel going into this. So I think I want to start with Rosemary's Baby, which came in 1968, which was 5 years prior to Don't Look Now, and this was Polanski adapting the book himself. And we start off immediately with this really creepy music with the very contrasting big pink lettering on the screen, that kind of gives us that sort of contrasting vibe that we're going to see throughout the whole movie, visually and otherwise. Um, and what I really love about this movie right away is that that's how it's not like immediate in regards to the horror of it, as far as like what's right in your face, but the creepy factor is there pretty much the whole time, just really, really kind of underlying in a way, especially in a when you've seen it like multiple times. Like it's actually one of those movies where instead of it being like there's some big scary finale, which of course there is, but it's knowing what already happens doesn't really matter, because it's like the more you see the movie and the more details you see that lead up to what that moment is what makes it as horrifying as it does. So really, it gets more horrifying every time you see it. And we'll go into some of the details of that kind of throughout, like when they're being shown the apartment at the very beginning here. And there's obviously already with like Hutch's character, we're getting the sort of like horror stories behind it. And it's like these, like, it seems like, a very normal apartment, and we're not quite sure if you're going in the first time what direction this is going, whether it's going to be paranormal or something else entirely, or even how you can even define that, really, in regards to the events of what happens here. But when we hear the backstories from Hutch of all the different things that have happened here, it feels like you're hearing the backstories of a haunted house or something. So it kind of sets up this sort of classic sort of horror vibe or creepy vibe or all that, but the way it's handled is done in what kind of feels like its own way. Like there's so many movies ever since this came out that have been compared to it in regards to the feel of it. And it's like, whether it be, there's actually a character that ends up getting pregnant with something otherworldly, people immediately say, oh, so it's like Rosemary's Baby. But even just sort of like the impending dread, or the idea of like creepy neighbors. Like it almost sort of hijacked that from Rear Window, but it's like instead of the creepy neighbors being across the way, they are literally like there's just a wall between you, a very thin wall at that. Um, and within that also we've got like these moments that once again we know exactly what they mean, and they can be just as creepy either on both sides of that, either when you do know what it means or you don't know what it means. And one that immediately comes to mind at the very beginning here is the chest blocking off the closet. And it's like, yeah, I've been in houses before where people just didn't use certain like storage areas or something, so there's just something that'll be in front of a door that has nothing behind it. But it's like when they pull it out and you realize that it's like a fully functional closet with like necessities in it, it gives you this vibe that something really bizarre went down. On top of the fact that the woman that used to live in this apartment that just died was frail enough that it makes no sense that it got there or however it did. And it's little seeds like that planting through the whole story. Like I said, it gets more and more creepy the more you know, rather than necessarily the less you know. Even though it is, if I remember correctly, a pretty visceral experience when you spend the whole movie asking questions. um, but it's so much creepier in kind of its own way when you know pretty much everything, especially looking at the marriage of Rosemary and Guy, where it's seeing the way he changes throughout the story is kind of incredibly terrifying. But before we even get into that, before we even met the Caswitts or anything, there we get a look at their marriage here, and it feels like a very like lived-in relationship, especially with the performances that Farrow and Cassavetes are doing here. And we get moments like when they decide they're gonna, break in the apartment, even though they don't even have like a visible bed yet in this room, or any visible furniture, I guess I should say, in this room. So they're just gonna do it right here on the floor, and it's like there's something so lived in yet sort of nonchalant about the way they just sort of unceremoniously disrobe. um, but it still comes back when like they're in the moment. He's like still joking about the cannibals and stuff like that, and it makes it. And the combination of those two things makes it feel very real. And the more real that relationship feels, the more terrifying the movie's going to go on as he changes. So when we get these little hints here and there, like the hearing the chanting or the singing or whatever that is next door, during one of those whatever it is they're putting on, and like I said, it is one of those cases of it's could have just kind of felt like an Afraid of the Neighbors movie, if you just look at like the story like outlined on paper, but it's the way it's put together, because I've heard a lot of like criticisms thrown at the book for being like really generic in like the suspense department. But I was kind of surprised because I read the book after I'd seen the movie a few times, and I was really surprised that Polanski seemed to have adapted it like directly, like word for word and scene by scene, and even the way some scenes are described are exactly the way they look on the screen. But I think what's so great about what Polanski did here was it's not necessarily, you could say as far as like maybe writing the script, it was just like a copy and paste job, but as far as bringing it to life like physically and visually, is where the real strength is. Because there's a quite a few things in the book where I was able to put, and I was able to get into the frame of mind where it's like, if I had read this before I saw the movie, I would have assumed this is something they didn't do in the movie, because it feels like it would be, there wouldn't be an effective way to film it. Like the way the dreams like bleed into reality and back and forth, the way they do when when you're kind of in that sort of going in and out of sleep sort of thing, and it's like, how do you put that on film effectively? Maybe you have a vague idea of how it could look on film, but maybe not in necessarily the way how well it's executed in the way that Polanski does it. Um, like that's the kind of thing where reading it, I would almost think like, how do you even film that? Like, there's no way they would do that. It would have to be something a bit more, like something we've seen before, like something more traditional, where it's just regular imagery, like we're looking at something, maybe shot slightly differently, and then just she wakes up. But the way it's able to kind of bleed in and out of reality, and that's obviously, I'm so glad that he took that approach as much as he could, since it plays such a huge part in the big scene. The scene that sets the whole story in motion is very important to have that feel of bleeding in and out of reality, and not knowing for sure which one is which. Especially since the main character doesn't know for sure that she was in a reality in that moment until the end, pretty much. um, but something I do want to talk about is the Cassavetes, because obviously Ruth Gordon won an Oscar, which is very cool and very inspired on the Academy's part. Um, but what's interesting about the Cassavetes is just how much of a contrast they are to everything. Like I was talking about with the pink lettering at the beginning, but with the creepy music, where it's like there's like every single thing about them is unnatural, even when we're first getting to know them. Because, like I said, obviously when you're in, like, we talked about this recently, where you're in, like, a stranger's place or something, or people you've just met, there's going to be a certain sort of unease, but but these people in general, even when they're being like so welcoming and so neighborly, it's almost weirder for it. And it's like just even their appearance, like towards the beginning or the very first time we see them, I think, after Terry has committed suicide and jumped out the window. And it's like we're at this really dire scene. We've seen Terry like on the ground and like she's bleeding out, and all the cops are here, and it's kind of frantic and it's tragic and it's shocking. And then it's like, who was she staying with? And it's like, oh, the cast of it's there they are now. And in this dire situation, we cut to the cast of it, and they're so like colorful looking, like the way they're dressed, just coming out of the night. And that I feel like that shot by itself pretty much sets up exactly what we're in store for with them. And then they continue that throughout, like the way Ruth Gordon delivers her line so perfectly, where it's like she's so constant and she's so nosy, like all of her sentences are like running together, like before she even finishes a thought or before you have time to respond to one of her thoughts, she's already on the next thing, and it's like you're desperately trying to keep up with her or just letting her go, and it's like that's also the perfect representation of just some regular old neighbor that just talks a lot or wants to know too much, but is well-meaning regardless. But there's something about this performance that really has that unnatural quality underlying that just really makes it come to life in this really scary way. So that was absolutely an Oscar well deserved. But Roman is also quite bizarre in his own right. There's a really interesting scene, the way it's shot, that I always found unsettling for some reason, was when they first get into the Casabets apartment for the first time and they're visiting and everybody's being super neighborly and super nice to each other, and Roman, while he's talking to them, sits over here, and it's like he's a mile away from them. Because every time we cut to him, it's only him in the shot, and he just looks so far away from everything else, even though they're talking like they're right next to each other. I don't remember quite the geography of the room and if he actually is relatively far away, but the way it's shot just makes it feel like he's so like on another planet, while just naturally conversing with them in this very unnatural way. And just tiny little details there that no attention's even drawn to, like when they're at the dinner table and Minnie's offering Guy a second helping of dessert, and she serves him with the fork that she's currently eating with. And just little details like that, even if it's not like right front and center, there's just these little things that make these people really, really unsettling in a way. Sometimes subtly, sometimes maybe not so much, but that's more so later. But what another thing I was talking about in regards to how Guy changes throughout, because it's another case where when you're watching it like multiple times, it becomes more and more obvious like that something is really like wrong in what exactly is going on here. Like I don't know why, but a scene that's always made me really uncomfortable was when Rosemary decides that she wants to go back to Dr. Hill. Not even go back to Dr. Hill. She just wants to go to Dr. Hill for a second opinion. Like that's it, just to get his take on it, and that's it. And Guy is like so, like there's such a desperation in Guy for her to like never see Dr. Hill again and to only stick with Dr. Saperstein. It's like the way he gets so like desperate in telling her, like saying like, you can't do that to Dr. Saperstein, and not even, thinking about what she needs or anything like that, because we already know as a character where he is right now and what he's already done at this point. And it's still stunning. I debate myself with where it's like which one is more terrifying, when you know the reason or when you don't. Because obviously when you don't, it just kind of seems like he's erratic for whatever reason, and it's certainly like off-putting in the right way, but I think it's when you do know is when it's a lot more terrifying, because it's almost like you can get a sense of how much is like at stake at this point, and like what are the consequences if it doesn't go right. And it's like all these sort of questions are like kind of the really scary shit. But it's also just this thing about how not really knowing like most of the people you know. Like whether it could be your neighbors, it could be some friends you met recently, or it could be the person you're married to. Because it's like that's always like I've always kind of tried to stay in the like when I'm like exploring something like girls that I've known like over time or people that are like kind of somewhat friends or people that I know a little bit. The whole idea of casual dating has always kind of been really weird to me because it's like this person that could come from God knows where is going to suddenly become like this significant part of your life, and it's like you never really quite know what you're bringing in. And so it's like and how basically a lot of this story is kind of that concept. um, and it's like even if I mean, not to say Guy was like already into some sort of thing like this. Like it was, there's, there's some sort of recruitment thing with the castmates once they meet each other, which we see for the first time, as far as we know, and it's like I said, that whole thing where Guy just gets more and more distant when everything was so intimate to start with, and it's like you see these two people, and it's like, oh, they look like they've known each other forever, or they've been together forever, but it's like all it takes is, hey, we can get you this part, and hey, we can make you successful, and all that. And suddenly, Guy is ready to give up everything and sacrifice everything and make these drastic leaps into what we see is going down, to put it as mildly as possible. Um, so I think that in itself may be the most terrifying thing because of how real it is. I mean, like, you can bring, the witches and the devil and stuff and all that into this as much as you want to. And that will certainly be terrifying in its own right. But it's really the whole thing of the people you know not being the people you know, is really... Even Dr. Hill is a great example of, like, you literally cannot trust anybody. Because obviously there's some people you can trust, like Hutch, but when they are dealt with, I guess you could call it, and you run out of people that you know for a fact you can trust, the facades start dropping quicker and quicker. And it's like there's... What I really love about the fact that... Well, really the fact that Dr. Hill is played by Charles Grodin, of all people, is the fact that he's... If I remember correctly, we don't get a really good look at him the first time we see him, the first time she's in his office. I mean, you can tell it's Charles Grodin by his voice is a dead giveaway. He's like 85 now and he still sounds the same. um, but there's something like comforting here, and you can sense Rosemary's comfort with him. And obviously, what Ralph Bellamy is doing is like the total contrast of that, which is amazing. Where Dr. Saperstein just looks sinister. Dr. Saperstein looks like he owns a fucking castle on a hilltop that's always surrounded by thunderstorms. But Dr. Hill over here seems very normal and like comfortable, and he's much younger. So there's that, and then we don't see him again until much later, when she's gone to him as a last resort. And the thing here is something kind of immediately seems off. Like it's almost comedic how much he suddenly seems off. And like the way he like moves in and out of the room is like way suspicious. Like it's intentionally being over the top at this point because we're so late in the movie at this point about who she can and can't trust. But it's like she's so relieved at this moment to just be like out of Dr. Saperstein's hands and into his, that it's almost like she's totally blind to just how suspicious he's acting already. But I do like that they do kind of throw some things in there in the way he speaks to make it not too obvious. Like the way like the way he seems to start to believe her, and when she's telling the whole story, and it's like if he believed her too much, that would be immediately suspicious. So I like the little moment they throw in where she says, "So you believe me?" And he says, "Well, I don't believe in like witchcraft, but I believe in maniacs, and so that's why I'm gonna help you." So like that is enough to make it feel like even if he seems suspicious, there's just enough of a seeming reality there that he might still be trustworthy. And I said just the way he moves out of the room though when he lets her lay down, it's like you can just tell they were what was going to happen next when the door opened again, even if Rosemary was blind to it. Um, and I love the way they play with this stuff. It's something I haven't really mentioned yet. Is just how incredible Mia Farrow is in this, because because her performance has a whole lot of different things going on throughout the whole thing. Because obviously Cassavetes is the same way, because his character kind of goes through that change that we've been talking about this whole time. But his is kind of more subtle and like intentionally hiding itself, whereas all of Rosemary's reactions are like right out here in the open. Um, and the way she's able to do that without going into like sort of like cheesy horror movie mode, which would have probably been very easy to do because a lot of it's going to be reaction shots. But it's like, I don't know. I can't really think of a false note off the top of my head that she hits. Because even if it does seem a bit maybe over the top or almost campy, it feels like it's intentionally that. Um, but we get stuff like the whole first portion here when there's something like really sort of innocent about her, which is really contrasted in these scenes when we get her like eating raw meat and she's almost like animalistic, is like really jarring and kind of sudden for the character turn. But then we also get stuff like which is sort of the general maternal nature to her, particularly in the scene when we learn that she's been feeling pain for like 2 months or something, and that's been like consistent throughout. And she's being told like, "Oh, it's gonna go away. It's gonna go away," which of course, that's to trust Dr. Saverstein, which, yeah. And then when it just kind of suddenly does, and there's like that split second where she thinks the baby has died, and we just kind of hold on it, and then she realizes the baby's still alive. And it's like that change where it's like everything that's gone on, everything like sinister surrounding this whole thing, kind of seems to fade out in that moment, when she realizes that the baby's still alive inside her. And there's something just really powerful in those moments. And then we get more of it when the movie starts to get more and more suspenseful, like the phone booth scene. When she leaves Dr. Saverstein's office to go to Dr. Hill's, and like everybody that comes up to this phone booth could be one of them. It's like that's the point we've eventually reached. Where like I said, it could be just like we were talking about how scary it is that it's the people closest to you, let alone everybody else. But it's like this is a scene that shows that it's also just as scary that it could be anybody else too. And it's like especially the way the people like loom around the phone booth, but it's the way Farrah plays this scene is so perfect because, like I said, all the emotions we talked about, all the changes she goes throughout the movie, as far as like her reaction shots and all that, and the emotion, is all kind of like we get like a glimpses of each of those in this one scene. Like she goes through all the different things in this one scene, where it's like I said, there's almost a bit of a comedic nature to it when she's like pretending to talk on the phone, when she thinks people are like roaming around or going to try to get in or whatever. But then we also have moments when she puts together the title of the book, being All of Them Witches, and she's starting to add up in her head how many people are involved in this, and it makes her like spastically giggle in this moment, and it's like, yeah, what other way would you react having put all these absurd pieces together in this thing that makes way too much sense when it should make no sense. And that moment in itself, that moment when she like laughs when she says all of them witches out loud, might be like her best moment in the entire movie, and it's like a fraction of a second. And like I said, just everything is, whereas like she's always waiting on edge, like she's always on the verge of like potential, is she going insane or is she not? Is she paranoid or is it all really happening? And that's, yeah, and like I said, all of it's building up to this final scene, this really iconic scene where we do have the birth, which is pretty much off screen, and like the build up to it relies on us as an audience to basically know this isn't the ending. Like when guy comes in and says like, oh, the baby died, sorry. It's like we as an audience just kind of know in that moment that's not true, and so we're like, and I feel like we know it immediately also. Like we know enough at this point to not trust what they say on a surface level, that them basically telling us the story's over makes us much more tense because we know it. There's no way it can be. And then we get the whole thing of her walking in, and it's like we were talking about this whole thing about how we're sort of bleeding in and out of her dreams and bleeding in and out of reality, and it's like this moment where she walks through the closet and then goes in, and then she goes in there, the cradle's there, and it's got that giant black cover on it, and everybody's around at this party, and it's like the way she walks in with a knife, ready to have like a full-on showdown for this baby, and people are barely even acknowledging she's there at all. It's like this is like her almost like we've been bleeding in and out of her dreams through the whole time. This is like her crossing into the threshold of the nightmare where she's going to live permanently from here on. And then that's when we get this closing scene where she basically just accepts her role. And it's one of the most haunting things in movie history. And there's really no other way to put it. So, like I said, really the main strength of the movie is the two different kinds of horror it's doing here, where we've got kind of more of a nightmarish quality on one side that definitely works, especially in the way that it's presented to us. But then there's also the more real aspect of basically your trust being shot in pretty much anybody, no matter how close they are to you, and that you never really fully 150% know somebody when you think that you might, which is one of the scariest things ever. So I think that pretty much sums up how I feel about Rosemary's Baby in general. So yeah, it took it's easy. It's like it's gonna easily be a movie to where it may not fully resonate with you or hit with you on the first time, or maybe even the second time. But like I said, once you really get to know its ins and outs and get to know the characters, and when you start to really see how everything falls into place, it becomes significantly scarier the more you understand it. So that's just great storytelling, visually and otherwise. So talking about visual storytelling, that pretty much is a pretty direct segue to Don't Look Now and its opening scene. But before, obviously, I just talked about Rebecca, and I alluded to the fact that we were going to be talking about Don't Look Now, because it's another Daphne du Maurier story, but it's a short story in a one of those book collections that's Not After Midnight, I think is the title. Where I've read Rosemary's Baby, I have not read the story for Don't Look Now, but I would really like to. But just how it looks on paper would be very interesting to me. And what's really interesting also is that even though the movie is like an hour 50, it's very easy to see how it started as a short story. But once again, like Rosemary's Baby, it's the filmmaking that really brings the story to life here. Starting with the whole idea of it basically having to depict clairvoyancy in a really interesting but also kind of terrifying way. And as far as how gripping this opening scene is in the way that it does that, is these scenes we get where the editing plays a big part in this. We were kind of talking about the way Rosemary's Baby was shot. The editing is like the really big player in Don't Look Now, but we're not gonna, go against the cinematography by any means, but we'll talk about that also. But the way these scenes are sort of cut together kind of immediately. We were talking recently about the way editing can cause dread, where you kind of go, especially when you're going like back and forth between something, and especially if there's like no score, like there's only sound. But like if it's, well, yeah, I guess the cinematography plays a part here too, because it's always to me been one of the perfect movies for this time of year, because while there are movies that can like bring, like when you think about the fall and you think about the way everything looks. And oftentimes, especially if it's depicted in a certain way, there can be like a fun quality to that because it reminds you of like Halloween and stuff like that. But the way the fall is shot in Don't Look Now, especially the opening scene, where it looks just like really dark and gloomy and ominous. It's like, and we're cutting back and forth between the children who are outside not being watched and the parents inside who are working. And you just get this sense of something right away. Like, it's so, like, there's this really sort of thick energy between you and the screen during this opening scene with every time it cuts back and forth. And then it's the way, like I said, the way they kind of show the clairvoyancy, and they're kind of showing that Donald Sutherland has it without knowing that he has it. And it's the way it's sort of, there's much more blatant ways of showing it. Like, he throws something in the room and then it cuts to the daughter throwing the ball. But then there's also like more abstract ways that they do that, where these things kind of line up, ultimately leading to the tragedy that sets off the entire movie. And it's sort of like, it's sort of the way the clairvoyancy is shown in this movie almost kind of feels like it's like a deja vu that's just slightly off, to where it doesn't feel like it's exactly the same thing happening, but it's close enough, that you kind of get that sense of where obviously where some things will happen, and it's like in real life, like you as a person, where something will happen and it's almost like you almost get this sense like 5 seconds ago I knew that was going to happen, even though I couldn't have. And I feel like the movie's portraying that sort of thing really well, with the way the editing is put together here, which obviously becomes much more of a bigger thing as the movie goes on. But talking about there's even that moment where I don't even know if it's in that direction, but I feel like nothing in this movie is unintentional. So the moment when he's talking about how like he refers to what the psychics are doing as mumbo jumbo, and she says like, "Oh my God, they said the same thing," and it's like even something like that, where it's like that it could easily be dismissed as coincidence. It's like in this world, in this story, it's coincidences don't feel like a thing. So that in itself kind of sets off something that's a bit unsettling going into it. But once again, is like the way Rosemary's Baby starts off. Looking at the marriage and examining it is a really interesting. They do this really interesting thing at the beginning with this sort of somewhat the beginning juxtaposition in regards to this very, very famous scene in the movie, the sex scene. But even before the sex scene, I actually am thinking about the bathroom scene, where they've both just kind of bathed separately, but they're there. And when I was talking about Jacob's Ladder, I was talking about the way nudity is used sometimes in movies in regards to how it depicts relationships, and how it's depicting a couple in a movie, especially a married couple, that are just so like being naked in front of each other is just a thing. And it's like it makes the relationship feel that much like closer and real, because when you usually watch movies and there's couples that are unclothed, they're like desperately trying to keep some PG-13 rating, where they're desperately trying to cover themselves, and it's like it just every time that happens in a movie, the relationship and that whole situation just does not feel real. It feels very a scene in a movie. So to just kind of watch them walking around carelessly like that in front of each other really sets up like a realism to the marriage and how it's depicted. And then, if that's not enough of a closeness for you, the next scene happens. The scene that started so many damn rumors, all of which have pretty much been denied, which doesn't surprise me. There's some people that think it started an affair between Sutherland and Julie Christie. There's some people that think the scene was unsimulated. Donald Sutherland told a pretty lengthy, gave a pretty lengthy laydown of what all happened and like the technicalities of it and all that. And it's it doesn't. I doubt it. Like, I doubt any of those rumors actually happened in that case, especially with how mechanical it all has to be and choreographed it has to be, and you've got people, like, directing you and all that. But despite that, like, even if the emotion wasn't actually there in the scene, and it actually was kind of a terror to shoot, and I think actually it was the first scene they shot together as well. Like it was like one of the first few times they had worked together, if I heard correctly. But like I said, there's so many rumors surrounding this movie. I don't know what's true and what isn't. But that's would be, yeah, because I think I heard that Rogue had said that he wanted to get the scene out of the way. So that was one of the first scenes. But still, it's interesting that if that's the case, and all that discomfort went into making that scene, how well it comes off in the screen in regards to what we're supposed to get out of it, and the closeness of it. But when I was talking about juxtaposition, it's the fact that this is actually cutting back and forth between the scene when they're like getting dressed and getting ready to go somewhere, and it's like it's kind of showing you the like that whole thing where like there's a closeness and then there's almost like a distance of sorts. Like I said, there's a sense here where you can think like even the closeness and the distance are both signs of comfort in the relationship. But there's also something about like showing them like back and forth. Like when it shows them like together in this very passionate sex scene, when we are cutting back to them dressed and in different rooms, it makes the distance feel all the farther apart. So that's the way I took that, but I feel like that could go either direction. But yeah, so that's pretty much what I take away from that, which is probably the most famous scene in the movie outside of the last one of the last scenes. But certainly one of the most famous sex scenes of all time, I would think, and the most what's the word, passionate, I guess. So props to them for being able to put that on the screen the way they did, even if it was not by any means a comforting shoot. So another thing about the setup between the two characters, though, is that in Rosemary's Baby, we had them seemingly starting a life together, but yet getting more and more distant. There's clearly something between them here, that being the death of their daughter in the opening scene. And the thing about this is that when you look at recent movies like Ari Aster's movies, Hereditary and Midsommar, you'll find that using grieving is like it turns out is a really effective thing to put into a horror movie, because it's like, I feel like in a couple of ways at least, because it's like when you're watching somebody like really, really like grieve like this, like there's even before we're in the moments, like in the aftermath, just the moment when he pulls her out of the water and screams the way he does. There's something so chilling and uncomfortable about watching people grieve, especially heavily, especially if it would be one of their children. So that in itself kind of already sets off like a real sense of unease on like an emotional scale, which almost kind of gets the audience vulnerable before we go into like horror territory already. So that's shown to be very effective. But then there's also, I think, just in general, when we're looking at character and we're seeing like such raw emotion from the characters is going to make it we're more attached to them when the horror starts to hit, or whatever it may be, or the terror, whatever you want to call it in a story like this. But that's the thing too, is the way the horror is handled in this, where horror almost feels like a strong word, but it's like the whole idea of the like impending doom and the dread that comes from kind of knowing the setup here, where we're under the impression that Sutherland is in danger of some kind, and then we just leave it at that, and we have to go the rest of the movie with that. So like every move Sutherland makes, if you're watching it for the first time, you wonder if this could be the character's end. And I think what's really interesting to me is obviously the dread and all of that does that absolutely, but something like unintentional on the filmmaker's part, surely. Like I highly doubt somebody like Rogue ever had this in mind. But something that I think also plays a huge part in this, if you're the kind of person that pays attention to this kind of thing, is the billing. Because even though Donald Sutherland is kind of our center of the story here, especially since Julie Christie leaves for a large portion of it after a while, and we mainly focus on him, it's interesting that Julie Christie is credited first and Donald Sutherland is credited second. I think she was also much more prolific at the time, which would explain that. But she 3 years before many years before, 65. I was still in 68 with Rosemary's Baby. In 65, she had won her Oscar for Darling, but with Donald Sutherland being second credited, it makes it seem like he's expendable, like more expendable than she is. So it's like if you're watching the movie for the first time, any corner he turns could be the last one, and then the story would suddenly go to Julie Christie. But the fact that we get that through the whole movie, and Sutherland just kind of remains the main focus throughout, is like a really good. Once again, I doubt that was even intentional on their part, because I don't think anybody pays attention to the billing, but as they go into a movie, but that's always stuck out to me. But yeah, going in on that though, there is like when we do get moments when he's like kind of in denial of what's going on, but it's like the more the dread mounts and the more obvious it seems that something bad might happen to him, especially with the maybe or maybe not visions, whatever they may be, are coming in and out. It's like the more the dread like mounts up, the more the denial kind of builds up, and we know even in it could be a very cheesy B horror movie, or it could be like Rosemary's Baby and Don't Look Now. The more you deny it, the more real it probably is. So, and just the way that builds throughout this whole middle portion, especially. And we get those like teases of it, like sometimes big teases, sometimes small. Like a big tease would be when he's hanging off of like the scaffolding or whatever it is, and or there's moments like when he uncovers the gargoyle, and it's like really deformed and weird looking, and it's like it could literally be him. His life is in danger at that very moment. He's hanging on something that he could drop to his death, or just seeing an image can give you the same vibe of, I feel like this is not going to go well. Like, I just have this horrible, terrible feeling inside that this is not going to be a happy ending for really anybody. And like I said, big or small, the fact that they work equally is incredible. Actually, the small things may work even more. Because they kind of get under your skin more, whereas when he's hanging off the thing, you're kind of reacting more in the moment. But yeah, so and yeah, obviously, I believe Anthony B. Richmond is the cinematographer who won a BAFTA for this. That's the kind of thing where we see, like, just the way everything is shot, particularly Venice, where usually when you see, like, take another Don Sutherland movie, for instance, in, like, The Italian Job, where that's just the first thing that comes to mind because it's hilarious to see him in Venice again, where in a lot of movies, Venice is basically shot like it's an advertisement for like tourism, and it looks really great, of course. But the way Venice looks here, where like it looks empty, like it almost looks like some sort of weird dead zone or something. Like it almost feels like an alternate reality Venice, from how we usually see it depicted on screen, and like there's such an empty, ominous feel to it the whole time. And obviously that's on top of the fact that we know that there is a killer running around somewhere, which we don't realize in the moment that we're seeing, but we are. But we get like the scenes where like bodies are dragged out of the canals and all that. Just everything feels like this almost like gateway to hell of sorts. But it's like, yeah. So and that's all the more brought to our attention by like the side characters. Even some of the side characters just kind of give us weird vibes. Like one of my favorite details, I think, is the inspector that starts to kind of follow him. To my understanding, he didn't actually speak English, so he learned his lines phonetically, and like they liked so much the way his lines sounded, where he didn't really know what he was saying. Just make it kind of this sort of like off its axis way of delivering lines that makes it feel really unsettling whenever he's speaking, and we're not quite sure which direction he's leaning, and it's so even details like that can really make it come to life, the horror of it come to life in a really big way. But then obviously another thing is the use of red throughout. I'm going to assume M. Night Shyamalan probably borrowed that for The Sixth Sense, where like the whole thing where you can tell whenever the dead are around in The Sixth Sense because there's some sort of red that shows up, and that's pretty much what Rogue and Richmond are doing here with the basically red basically signifies like the oncoming death in a certain way. Obviously, most clearly the way the daughter and eventually we learn the killer little person wearing. So what they're wearing. So and that's pretty much brings us to our ending, which talking about the reveal of who is wearing the red coat. And it's basically this, I don't know how else you can describe it, being like one of the most famous horror movie scenes of all time. But it's basically like a monument in scenes that just shock you to like your absolute core. Like that's one of those things where there are movie moments, many movie moments throughout your life if you seek out all different kinds of movies early enough that you will never ever forget the first time you saw them. You may forget your experience with most of them. I know a lot of people who have only seen Don't Look Now once or twice mainly come away with the sex scene and the last scene, and they don't really remember anything else about the movie apart from just kind of the general feel of it. Um, but that particular image, not just the killer is themselves, but it's and what happens. But it's like it's so interesting how you have the like obviously the whole movie is working in so many different ways on such like an artistic level and how it brings its horror to life in all the different ways we've talked about and the way it depicts everything. And it's like those moments where you see one moment that lasts maybe 10 or 20 seconds and you just immediately have that feel of this 10 or 20 seconds, this little tiny bit of time is what the whole product of everything we've just seen. Like we didn't even realize, like we assumed we're building up to something, but we don't know in the moment necessarily that that moment is going to be seconds long. Um, but yet it's still immediately when it happens, you immediately know this is what it was all coming to. And it's really powerful shit, and like I said, terrifying and unforgettable, um, and haunting. So, and all those other adjectives. It's like, what else can you really say when it is like I said, it is a monument in horror movie history. Obviously both of these, you can kind of say the same thing about Rosemary's Baby's ending, but I feel like Rosemary's Baby kind of had a lot more in the kind of almost having like two different sets of horror going on like parallel to each other. Um, so I would say like I mean if I had to choose, I think Rosemary's Baby is my favorite of the two, and I feel like there's more like Don't Look Now does feel like it's more about the payoff than Rosemary's Baby is because it's like I feel like if Rosemary's Baby was more about the payoff, we would like I know some people were disappointed we don't actually see uh, Adrian or Andrew, whichever she wants to. There's the whole scene in the book right before it ends where she like fights to have him called Andrew instead of Adrian. But here we just kind of see her kind of accepting everything. But I don't know which one of those is more effective, but I feel like they both work. But um, yeah, but I do feel like that the journey in Rosemary's Baby is more like kind of it's hard to say involving because obviously Don't Look Now is also, but yeah, I feel like in regard like Rosemary's Baby has that experience where you can keep going back and every time you watch it it gets scarier and scarier with those details, and I think that's something that you might not find as prominently in Don't Look Now, and I think that's the thing that kind of keeps at least me coming back to Rosemary's Baby over and over again. In a way, I don't quite revisit Don't Look Now as much. Um, but like I said, even knowing what a payoff is that only lasts for like a few seconds, it's incredible how much Don't Look Now is still worth the journey and just how much it puts those feelings in you you really don't want in there, but the fact that you don't want them in there is what makes the ride so thrilling. So, yeah. So I think that's going to be it for these two. Once again, we're just piling a whole bunch of stuff here in the next few days. The other Salem's Lot and Fright Night is going to be right after this, and then after that, you're just getting a whole bunch. There's a couple of series. Me and my brother are still supposed to do a list video. A couple more individual ones here. Some standalone things. That new Craft movie. All that stuff is just going to be packed in here real close, but we'll get it out. So until all that stuff, I think that's it for this.